When should I get started? In like a minute?
Yeah,
Or just,
whenever
yeah?
you're ready.
Okay.
We have a
Give it
couple
one
more
more
people
minute.
chatting.
Yeah, I see. Mr. Ballman is awesome. Oh, there, okay. If you could mute that guy, that'd be great.
I'm gonna mute everyone for you.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Okay, awesome. We'll try to avoid that as best as we can, but I serve on the National Committee for Students Supporting Israel. Very grateful to have been doing that in this capacity for the past year, just helping develop new programs, new ideas, new strategies for Israel activism on campus. And I was also president of Students Supporting Israel at UCLA, where I'm a senior now, last year. The previous year, before I transferred to UCLA, I was president at Santa Monica College at their amazing chapter there. I see a lot of people that are here from SSI. I want to give them a shout out. And for those of you who are not yet involved or familiar with SSI, I highly recommend you check us out on social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, the whole thing. I'm going to tell you a little bit about this presentation now. I'm going to share my screen. So let's see. If I have the right page. Do you guys see a PowerPoint screen or no? You do? Okay, perfect. Amazing. So I'm going to go full screen. And basically, this presentation is a series of concepts that I put together a few months ago. I've written an article that has not been published yet. I haven't sent it out. But it's a series of ideas, loose ideas that I came up with after a few years of interacting with anti-Zionist arguments, anti-Israel rhetoric, behavior, propaganda, both on social media and on campus in personal interactions with professors, with students, and so forth. And what I really came down to was a number of categories of anti-Zionist methods, means, or techniques of disenfranchisement. And what does disenfranchisement mean? In general, it's just a fancy word for trying to take away the rights of. So when we talk about disenfranchisement in the United States, for example, we could talk about voter disenfranchisement, African Americans for the several hundred years of slavery, you know, into the independence of the United States and passed into the Emancipation Proclamation, all these amendments and so forth. Didn't have the right to vote. Anti-Zionist principles of disenfranchisement are basically techniques that anti-Zionists or anti-Israel people try to justify taking away the rights of Jewish people to have a country like any other people and their right to self-determination. So we're going to jump right in. And I just want to let you guys know that this list expanded from, it went from 5 to 6 to 7 to 8. I thought it would shrink a little bit. I actually tested out a lot of these points with other people. And the number 8 stuck. But if you guys want to rework, revise my theory, this is what this presentation is there for. Otherwise, I hope this really popularizes, and we'll explain the significance as we go through. So let's talk about anti-Semitism today and facts and figures. Just going into some numbers here, I took a look at some FBI hate crime statistics. This is the latest that's been published. Even though we're in 2020, they haven't released 2019 yet. And I don't think they will anytime soon given the situation of coronavirus, but we got to do the best we can. Here, if you just take a look, anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic hate crimes are the highest out of any religious-based group, coming in about almost 60%, okay? Islamophobic or anti-Islamic, anti-Muslim hate crimes and attacks in the United States are at 13%. So that's following second, but we can argue that anti-Jewish attacks are pretty disproportionate in terms of hate crimes based on religious motivation. When we look at releases on anti-Semitic hate crimes on campus, for example, there's many different reports out there, but one of the greatest organizations I look to is the Amcha Initiative. And you can go online to their website, type in Amcha Initiative on your browser, and just take a look at their press release recently from the past year. They found that incidents tracked on over 400 campuses recorded in the past few years, 2015 and 2018, there was an 86% range of anti-Israel incidents attributed to BDS-related activity, okay? And 615 recorded campus incidents were found in 2019 alone, which is crazy. There was an increase in faculty enacted incidents as well, but what really sticks out is this 70% spike of anti-Israel anti-Semitism and academic BDS at its epicenter. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the BDS movement, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, it is a movement that was founded around 2005 by Omar Barghouti and a few other Palestinian scholars. And it's basically a delegitimization campaign to distort, demonize, and attack and undermine Israel's right to exist. And it has taken off in many universities. It has claimed to be descended from other social justice movements. It definitely uses social justice language in order to justify disenfranchising Jews. And we're going to go through real examples on social media, in rhetoric, in actual documents from the Palestinian Authority government and interviews and so forth that all describe what I'm telling you right now very clearly. And so you'll start to see these patterns. Okay. So anti-Zionism, understanding it as rebranded hate is very important. We're gonna see throughout this presentation how classical anti-Semitism, ranging from religious-based hatred to hate of Jews as a race, as scientific or Enlightenment pseudoscientific anti-Semitism, has been promulgated throughout time, but especially in the West and in the United States. And recently, the hatred of the Jewish state as a collective symbol of Judaism or the Jewish people, the Jewish culture, Jewish ethnicity, and so forth, has been the primary expression of new anti-Semitism that we can see throughout these photos. So down here, this image with this Palestinian flag, that was a protest you might have seen in May 17th of 2018. That was on my campus at UCLA. We were called terrorists and white supremacists and all sorts of things. But the conflagration of Nazism and Zionism as like a similar pattern is just one example of this demonization. See Zionist criminals and the Palestine Holocaust. We're going to talk about what all these accusations and demonizations mean when it comes to these 8 principles that I'm going to lay out. So this whole presentation is about dismantling anti-Zionist psychology and rhetoric. It requires being specific, right? Because if we're unable to pinpoint exactly what someone is saying and why they're saying it, we just can't dismantle it. We can't take it down. We can't attack it. So very commonly in the pro-Israel or Zionist or Jewish world, we find an issue of putting into words what anti-Zionists mean, what they're doing when they're spewing prejudice or hatred. And it's very difficult for us to explain to other people that aren't Jewish or maybe don't know much about the Israeli-Arab conflict. And so it's important to be specific. It's important to make the concepts easily transmittable. And you have to have the commitment to use it in many areas. Otherwise, it's not going to stick. So this is what these 8 principles are going to be about. So we have to identify by defining our language. We have to categorize and we have to combat. So you can just think of this as ICC. When we look at this Venn diagram, we see that in general, people have a range of beliefs. There's truths out there, and typically poorly justified true beliefs end up being the core of what a lot of us believe. And then within that, there's actual knowledge. But we're going to see throughout this presentation that just general beliefs and poorly justified true or even false beliefs will find their way in ordinary academic settings, in media, even in athletics, and in everyday life. So I just want to cover the shoulders I'm kind of standing upon when I'm discussing this topic. How many of you guys have heard of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism? Just put it in the chat, like give a thumbs up or something so I get an idea. I'll give you a second to do that. Just if you've heard of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. Okay, so I see one person hasn't yet. I'm guessing a few of you guys already know it. The IHRA is the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. And it's an organization that has assembled over 30 countries signing on to a definition of anti-Semitism that's gained a lot of traction in the past decade. And I highly recommend you actually go on their website and look at their documents and their definition of anti-Semitism, because it's widely accepted, not just in Europe and the United States, but throughout the world. And just take a look at that. I just took this excerpt here to understand, for you guys to understand what we mean when we're talking about anti-Semitism in general, as like a very broad thing. So I'm just going to read this real quick. Anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations might include the targeting of the state of Israel, conceived as a Jewish collectivity. And this is the real important part. However, criticism of Israel, similar to that leveled against any other country, cannot be regarded as anti-Semitic. Okay? So when we're talking about ordinary criticism of the Israeli government, whether it's policies related to minorities in the country, let's say we're talking about gay rights, LGBTQ plus rights, that's an issue that's across countries worldwide. That's something that Israel has been much more progressive in compared to its neighbors, but it still isn't perfect. There's still a lot of progression to go. So someone calling out the fact that Israelis of the LGBTQ community not being able to get married in Israel, they might have to go to Cyprus and get that recognized, or they can have a civil marriage recognized. That's not anti-Semitism. That's not illegitimate criticism. That's fair game. Okay. The other person I want to mention who's really pioneered the study of anti-Zionism and its manifestations as anti-Semitism is Natan Sharansky. He was a refusenik of the Soviet Union who was imprisoned, subject to solitary confinement and torture, and eventually made it all the way to Israel, who then became chairman of the Jewish Agency. And he has been a prominent figure in Israel's governance since. He created this term called the 3Ds, set of phrases, which you see here: demonization, delegitimization, and double standards. Now, I learned this when I was a Stand With Us high school intern, all the way back in 2016. Shout out to Stand With Us co-sponsoring this event. And it was a really good way for me to understand, how do we delineate, how do we tell the difference between anti-Semitism and legitimate criticism of the state of Israel? And Natan Sharansky's 3Ds have definitely stuck out in Zionist circles, and Zionist organizations, pro-Israel organizations, have used this method for a long time. In addition to Rabbi Jonathan Sachs of the UK, they've used similar language as well to try to indicate the difference for non-Jewish people who might just not understand what constitutes anti-Semitic language or rhetoric when it comes to talking about the state of Israel. And for me personally, and the people I've interacted with, Jewish students on campus and allies, I've seen how these terms have done a good job in empowering them to actually go out there and get the job done and have these difficult conversations with strangers. But at the same time, they haven't done enough. And so what these 8 principles, I keep talking about them. You guys are waiting. I'm sure you're on the edge of your seats. I'm just getting you ready to kind of get in the mindset of where I'm coming from with all this. When we look at classic anti-Semitism in anti-Zionism, we can see the regurgitation, the copying, the mimicking of the same key tropes, anti-Semitic libels and ideas. Nazi Germany, Der Stürmer, propaganda of 1938. Then we see the Soviet Union in the 70s, indicating the same thing. And this is Al-Raya in 2017, just a few years ago in the Arab world, all over Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. Okay, moving forward, we can see the same thing in medieval Europe with the Simon of Trent blood libel, you know, bloodletting, taking the blood of Christian children in medieval times up until present point, and using that for matzah, the baking of matzah, 1493 depiction, 1937, Der Stürmer, ritual mord, the same thing, same accusation, Al-Raya, a paper of Qatar, and this is courtesy of Palestinian Media Watch. This is from 2009. So we see the same disgusting depictions demonizing Jewish people, stereotypes, and just depicting Jewish people as inhuman. So let's look at these 8 principles, a test that actually shows how anti-Zionism is always anti-Semitism 100% of the time. These are the 8 points that we're going to go through: abrogation, appropriation, deletion, omission, distortion, inversion, imposition, and discrimination. A lot of shin, but I wanted to simplify this as easily as possible. In fact, I would have preferred that these points stay in 4 or 5 categories, but it was just very difficult for me to manage that. And so I hope this is a great resource for you to use, and I'm going to nail it in your heads so that you just can't forget it. And I'm going to give you guys resources at the end of this presentation as well, little graphics, infographics, or memes that might help you disseminate this, practice this, apply this in understanding and educating people why anti-Zionism, opposition to Jewish self-determination in the land of Israel, is always anti-Semitism in theory and practice. So we're going to get started on the first. Abrogation. So abrogation is the act of replacing, repealing, annulling, and so forth. And I'm going to give examples throughout for all these points, all the principles I show. The first example here, you can read it for yourself. Al-Haram al-Sharif, the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, is the site where Abraham was sent to sacrifice Ishmael, or Ismail. This is a theological form of abrogation that is discussed within Islam. The Al-Barak Wall, or the Western Wall, is solely a Muslim heritage site. We see that from United Nations Resolution 2334, a gross mischaracterization of Judaism's most holy site. And so when we look at actual examples also throughout social media and throughout the Palestinian government and so forth, we can see these same examples of abrogation being repeated, right? In student organizations, in BDS movements, in government circles or media circles in Palestine or in the Palestinian territories itself and in the Arab world, we see the same form being repeated. So this example in the bottom left is from the PA Minister of Culture, Atif Abu Saif. He says, there's nothing in history that proves his presence. This is discussing, it's a video from Palestinian media discussing Jewish history and denying the connection of Jewish history to the land, basically justifying disenfranchisement of the Jewish people in Palestine or in Israel, etc. Pence defiles the Al-Barak Wall. We just discussed this, the Al-Barak Wall, his visit to the Western Wall, unwelcome by the Israeli government, defiling this Palestinian Arab Muslim heritage site, another form of abrogation. And then right here, within our lifetime, United for Palestine, this is NYU's chapter of Students for Justice in Palestine. They are taking a picture of a sign on the street in Brooklyn that says, Jerusalem, the eternal capital of Palestine, Israel does not exist. If you zoom in or put your zoom on full screen, You might be able to see this poster. And so this is pretty self-explanatory. We're going to go into the second point, which is appropriation. Now you'll see I've kind of messed around a little bit with the art of these texts, so they kind of mimic, I guess, what they mean. So we see a lot of these letters kind of out of place. Appropriation, from a cultural perspective, is the act of unacknowledged or inappropriate adoption of the identity, the history, or the heritage of members of another society. So how many of you guys have heard of appropriation, let's say with Cinco de Mayo and white or European Americans dancing around with sombreros and tequila and eating just like Mexican food, whatever? You might consider that appreciation, but capitalizing off of the cultures of other people who might not even celebrate those things in that light or context, or having an excuse to get drunk, etc. That's not really valuing or appreciating their culture in the same way it is form of appropriation, putting on a mask or costume that means so much more to other people because it's who they are, right? So here we see the depiction of Jesus, who's a Jew, as a Palestinian wearing a keffiyeh, okay? Made in Palestine, this is the meme. Jesus was a Palestinian. It's from Nerdine Mohsen Kiswani. She was the president of NYC's SJP in Hunter College. Okay, a lot of these screenshots, if they're not from my own findings on the internet, they're from different reports that you can find, such as from Stand With Us and many different organizations. The ISGAP report on anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. This is Mahmoud Abbas in the bottom right corner saying this land belongs to the Canaanites who were here 5,000 years ago, referring to Palestine, and we are the Canaanites. If any of you guys have taken basic history courses in world history, you know that it was in the 7th century that Arabs first came to the Levant and invaded and basically took over. And genetic tests have also shown that Arabs of this specific region are not Canaanites. The remaining peoples of this land who have Canaanite lineage are Jewish, Samaritan, Phoenician, or Maronite. A lot of Christians in Syria or Israel or Lebanon. These people have Canaanite lineage, but nevertheless, it's a form of appropriation in this case to say that Jews inhabiting Israel today are fake. They're not actually Israelites, okay? A form of appropriation, and that Arab Palestinians are the indigenous peoples who belong to the land. Moving forward to deletion, the act of erasing, removing, or expunging. Saying things like Jews are only a religious group, or Jews around the world share no relation to each other as a separate ethnicity or nationality. And lastly, saying things like there are no archaeological findings to support Jewish historical claims in the land. All of these statements are manifestations of the principle of deletion, basically trying to remove or take out certain elements of Jewish history, identity, or Israelite or Israeli history and identity and consciousness, and basically throwing it out the window in order to say that Jews don't have a right to live here, or Jews don't have a right to have a country, etc. Jews don't have rights in general. That's what these points are all about, each and every one of them. It's about saying Jews don't have a right, and that is inherently anti-Semitic. So here in the left, we see a little map of Khazaria. I'm guessing a few of you guys have heard of the Khazars or Khazars. It's a Turkic ethnic group from the Middle Ages in the Caucasus or Central Asian region, a kingdom that historically had converted to Judaism. Many Nazis, neo-Nazis, anti-Zionists claim, even some Palestinians claim, that Jews, especially Ashkenazi Jews, are all descended from Khazars, that they are not Semitic in lineage and nature, but that they came from the Central Turkic group. They've done genetic studies, history and historical record attests otherwise, that Ashkenazi Jews, the overwhelming majority, are not a product of this Khazar lineage. But nevertheless, this is a nice conspiracy theory that still gets thrown around today, even in social justice circles and in accredited universities. So just be wary of that. It's a form of deletion of Jewish history. In the bottom left, the PLO charter. This is, you can consider this a founding government document in 1964. And through 1968 and so forth, this clause and this notion that Judaism, because it is a divine religion, is not a nationality, I'm quoting directly here, with independent existence. Furthermore, the Jews are not one people with an independent personality because they are citizens of the countries which they derive from, etc. So the facts of history and the true basis of sound statehood, Jews have maintained their language, they maintained their identity throughout diaspora, their customs, praying to Jerusalem. We just had Passover, Pesach. We finished the Seder by saying Lashana B'Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem. To say that we have no historic or spiritual ties with Palestine or with Israel, whatever you want to call this land, is systematic deletion of our identity. And it is anti-Semitism seeking to disenfranchise us. Halfway through, oh my God. Wow, I guess we left something out here. Just kidding. Omission, the act of leaving out, failing to mention. Okay, failing to mention something. When you're not deleting something, the reason why omission is a term included in this is because it's a little bit different from deletion. Omission is giving facts, right? Or giving pieces of information that may be true, but not giving the full picture. So still seeking to mislead or deceive. So a good example here is that Palestine has existed. Palestine has been around for a long time, yes, but in what context? As a sovereign entity, etc. Palestine has existed as a recent designation originally coined by imperials. The Roman Empire 135 CE under Emperor Hadrian renamed the land Syria Palestina after the Philistines. Who knows who the Philistines were? Just drop it in the chat. I'll give 500 imaginary dollars to whoever can name who the Philistines were. Roman era peeps, says Yosef. They actually ceased to have a hold in the region. Oh, whoops, going back. They ceased to have a hold in the region around the time of the Romans. They actually dissipated and assimilated a few centuries prior. But the Philistines were a Greek people from the Aegean Sea that actually settled in the southwest coast of Israel and colonized it, not just in the Gaza Strip area that we see today, but also in Egypt. So they also colonized parts of Egypt as well on the coast there. They're known as some of the sea peoples that came and were some of the worst, most infamous enemies of the Jewish people in the early days of the times of David and Solomon and so forth. Okay, and when the Romans renamed the land, Syria Palestina, they wanted to use that to replace the identity of Judea and rid the Jewish character of the land, essentially. Almost as a form of abrogation. But here in this case, we're talking about omission. This is an AJ Plus video, Al Jazeera, Qatari media, that is now popularized in the West because it is very trendy, going over many different social justice issues having nothing to do with the Middle East, and that's how they really reel people in and deceive them with whatever propaganda they actually want to squeeze in there. So this video, this is a screenshot of the thumbnail, who's cutting Gaza's power. When we talk about who's cutting Gaza's power, oftentimes the power lines in the Gaza Strip, the infrastructure that exists there, if it needs to get repaired, it's very unlikely that Hamas is actually going to let in the Israeli government or Israeli companies to fix the infrastructure there. So if there's a power outage or something because Hamas fired a rocket onto Israeli civilians and it actually landed in their own territory and broke a power grid, this has happened before, you can look it up. This is an issue. So implying that Israel is responsible for Gazan power outages all the time is very misleading, and it's omitting key details. Likewise, I've run into people in my comments threads showing this screenshot of this coin from the British Mandate. Palestine, that's in Arabic, Palestine, Palestina, Eretz Israel. We see that in the parentheses in Hebrew, okay? This was a British coin. This was not a coin developed from Arab sovereignty or Arab sovereign institutions, essentially. We can go on and on. I don't want to take too long, but we see screenshots from the BDS movement here. This is on Twitter, and SJP at UCLA on Facebook, my school, right? Saying without Israel's occupation and colonial terror, the Palestinian economy would double. Now, it's really important to point out that Palestinians, while they are oppressed and while they do lack a lot of resources, are the #1 recipient of foreign aid per capita in the world. If you go to Scholars for Peace in the Middle East, Asaf Ramirowski, who spoke at our school not too long ago, he was explaining how over $68 billion, I'm going to say it again, 68 billion, not million, but $1 billion has been invested in UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinians, as well as in the Palestinian Authority. All that money has gone to Palestinian leaders and so forth. A lot of it has ended up being pocketed by them or otherwise to pay for the Martyr Fund, to invest in missiles, or to pay for, as I said, the Martyr Fund, which is a series of legislative stipends to give to Palestinian civilians every month and their families if they commit a terror attack against Israeli civilians. That is a real thing. And any questions you guys have at the end, I'm happy to clarify, provide resources, and so forth. Moving on, distortion. This one was quite fun to mess around with when I was making it, but as you can see, each letter basically is distorted in a different way, and that's because there's a whole lot of BS out there. And distortion is, if we're talking about the vast majority of anti-Zionist accusations you might find, conspiracy theories and so forth, distortion is probably the most prominent one, the most populous point. And it's just the general act of giving false, misrepresenting, perverted, disproportionate, or twisted information. So saying things like the Jews are foreign, white, colonial usurpers. These are absolutely blown out of proportion, exaggerated, or just totally twisted. Saying things like Israel is an apartheid state when it has incorporated Arab citizens and its minorities in its governance since its independence up until the present day. That is a gross mischaracterization. That is distortion. Let's look at some actual empirical examples of this being posted around. So National SJP, God bless them, they're quoting one of their scholars, their pseudo-scholars here, Dr. Kawanwi. Israel does absolutely meet legal requirements for apartheid under international law, undebatable. Wow, well, that's a lot of proof you provided in that few worded sentence there, okay? Not very effective, as I just talked about, incorporation of Arabs into governments and institutions, ranging from athletics to media and even the army and so forth. We can talk also about this image here, this really gross, disgusting image of this chessboard where Palestinians are responding or rebelling, throwing stones and so forth, carrying flags, with Bibi Netanyahu, the prime minister, carrying a butcher's knife with the Israeli and American flags in the background and all these missiles, Iron Dome, tanks, and so forth. That is a gross distortion of Israel, characterizing it as this bloodthirsty, very similar to medieval blood libels and even blood libels from the Nazi era or the Soviet Union and so forth. This is a continuation. This is nothing original. Okay, Georgetown, SJP on Facebook. Zionism is Islamophobia. Zionism is racism. A racist Israeli bill aimed at banning mosques from using loudspeakers during certain prayer times. Again, this is just gross mischaracterization, misinformation. Okay. Reminder, Zionism is not Judaism, Rutgers SJP. Judaism is a holy religion. Zionism is often equated with Nazism, hashtag racism. First of all, if you want to sever Judaism from Zionism, it's very difficult to do that because Jewish practice is so centered around restoring the Jewish people back to the land, making aliyah, or returning the Jewish people back to the land whenever possible with the Mashiach, with the Messiah, or whatsoever. when we pray towards Jerusalem, when we mention the children of Israel, the people of Israel, and so forth, throughout our practices, our holidays, the fact that we have a large swath of mitzvahs, a large swath of commandments out of 613 that we can only fulfill in the land of Israel, it just doesn't make sense to say that Judaism and Zionism are inseparable. They're part of the same family, right? Zionism is just a modern movement to facilitate a recognition of the Jewish state in a modern context as like a state, right? That's what Theodore Herzl's movement was all about. Okay. And just saying that Zionism is equated with Nazism is just ridiculous. And that also pours into this, which is inversion, our sixth principle, which if you thought distortion was problematic, inversion is even worse, saying that Israeli Zionists or Jews, hinting at Jews, were beneficiaries of the Holocaust and are now perpetrating a Palestinian Holocaust. That's just flipping historic Jewish suffering onto the Jews, right? It's the act of reversing the roles or experiences of two totally disparate social groups and victim blaming them with what one might call in fancy terms, paradoxical vilification, right? Just total irony here. Here in the bottom left, this is a Palestinian media propaganda cartoon depicting a Jew with a kippah looking like ISIS, okay? And looking at himself in the mirror. This is Daesh, ISIS, we see written in Arabic, okay? Here, Haidar Eid has posted from the eastern fence of the Gaza concentration camp, right? We see these comparisons happening all the time, whether it's talking about death camps around the world, even on our border, there's a lot of gross mischaracterizations, no matter what you think of that humanitarian situation, okay? This is in Spanish, so mind you that all of this prejudice doesn't just manifest in one language, in English in the West, in England, or in Arabic, etc., in the Arab world, in America, Canada, and so forth. En Madrid, miles de personas denuncian genocidio en Gaza y piden suspensión de comercio de armas con Israel. Right? They're talking about suspension in commercial arms with Israel in Madrid, in Spain, okay? To denounce the genocide in Gaza, okay? We just had Yom HaShoah. We just had Yom HaShoah, commemorating the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, commemorating the Nazi Holocaust, killing 6 million Jewish people and millions more, Roma, LGBTQ people, and so forth, right? To say that what's happening in Israel or Palestine is a genocide is crazy. It's just insane, right? How can you claim to have experienced a genocide when your population has quadrupled over the past several decades, right? Whereas the Jewish population was at 16 million at least prior to the Holocaust, and today we're not even there yet, right? And it's been like 70 years since. What's going on? I don't even need to explain what's in the bottom right corner, saying Zionism is Nazism, and so forth. Zionism is racism, like the UN declaration resolution in 1975. Now let's talk about imposition. We're almost there, we're almost at the end, and then soon we're gonna take questions. I'm just gonna go over a few concepts furthering this after, but imposition is about the act of forcing an unusual, unreasonable, or unbearable burden, requisite, or task onto the Jewish people. Saying things like Israel can't be a Jewish state, you must first be an anti-Zionist to be a feminist, and so forth. We hear this in the Women's March. Linda Sarsour, co-founder, who was eventually kicked off, and it was a surrogate of Bernie Sanders' campaign. This is the mainstreaming of imposing anti-Semitic double standards onto the Jewish people by saying these things. I want to start with this guy in the middle, Ali Abu Nima. Electronic Intifada is a lovely resource if you are a heavy anti-Zionist and you want a lot of misinformation and resources to slander the Jewish people and the Jewish state. What does he say? Ali Abu Nima is saying the goal of hashtag BDS is the full restoration of Palestinian rights. Okay? He's talking about Palestinian rights, not an agreement to create an artificial mini-state in order to save Zionism. As if Zionism was a crime or something to just be swept under the rug into the dustbin of history, okay? Going into the top left corner, what does it mean when Zionists who advertently support the settler colonial nature of the Israeli state and the Gaza ghetto show up to ICE camps and demand their closure? The Jews we've seen at ICE protests have consistently and openly been anti-Zionist and pro-Palestine. Whoa, that was just a lot, right? Sometimes a lot of these accusations or rhetoric actually include multiple principles of disenfranchisement, multiple anti-Zionist principles. But this in particular, talking about the settler colonial nature of the Israeli state, how it must be dismantled. This is from Florida State University, SJP, member Reem Zaitoun. Just saying that Israel can't exist as a Jewish state because that would be akin to a human rights violation. It's placing an unusual, unreasonable, and unbearable burden on the Jewish people to dismantle their right and their defense of their own self-determination, essentially. And that would not be expected of by any other people, even including Palestinians, right? When we're talking about Jews in Judea and Samaria and the West Bank that account for such a small percentage of the actual territory. And we talk about the fact that there's only, like less than 5% of Israel's total population, 5 to 10%, something like that, is actually anywhere close to Judea and Samaria, mostly on the Green Line, what would be a border in a future Palestinian state. The fact is that we're not denying Palestinians the right to be a majority in their own state, just as we wouldn't say, Jews, you can't be a majority in your own state, and so forth. The French in France, the Italians in Italy, the Libyans in Libya, the Chinese in China, you can go on and on. Oh, lastly, Fatah promoted illustration invoking UN Resolution 194. Long story short, covering the right of return and the destruction of Israel as a Jewish state, saying that UNRWA, which designates that compared to any other, unlike any other refugee population in the world ever historically, Palestinians pass on their refugee status to their children, their grandchildren, no matter if they live in the United States as naturalized citizens, whatever, that they have to move back and live in Israel, back to the homes that they fled from or might have been displaced from in certain circumstances, and so forth, during the War of Independence, the 1948 war, when 3 years after the Holocaust, the Jewish people were facing another existential threat in the land, in the British Mandate. Okay, boom. Take a deep breath, everyone. We finally made it. What you've all been waiting for, this is the final point. And it's actually probably the simplest point. It's discrimination. This principle is about singling out unfavorably, treating unfairly, prejudice. So just merely saying things like Israel doesn't have the right to exist of all countries in the world, placing that double standard, or boycott Israel is discrimination. It's plain and simple. It's very clear anti-Semitism. It doesn't hide itself, even if it tries to come off as progressive or social justice-y, saying things also like Israel doesn't have the right to defend itself or its civilians, that it has to put up with Hamas rocket fire and cannot respond whatsoever, has to restrain itself at all times and just take it. That is something not expected of any other democracy, nonetheless any other nation in the entire world. So let's look at these examples. Boycott Israeli apartheid. We see this on, these are pomegranates, I think, grown in Israel. These stickers, hopefully you'll never see them in your supermarket, but this is in a UK supermarket, so boycotts there. Okay, discrimination. List of 2014 UN condemnations. This is just 2014. We can see this trend over the years, just like back to back to back. But we look here, what's highlighted in the bottom right corner, bottom left corner, I don't know if you can see, Israel was condemned by the United Nations in 2014 20 times. Afghanistan, 0. Central African Republic, 0. China, 0. And so forth. North Korea, 1. Russia, 0. Pakistan, 0. Sudan, 0. Syria, 1. Iran, 1. That's it. UC Divest, okay, another BDS campaign that just rebranded itself as something called UC Divest. They're sharing an article from the UC calling on all regions to divest from Israeli human rights abuses. Another gross mischaracterization, seeking to discriminate against the Jewish state, not advocating for a divestment from actual human rights violating regimes, as we mentioned before. I don't know why I included this guy here and Justin Trudeau when I made this presentation, but there's probably an article on this that that I can think of. Maybe it's because North Korea and Justin Trudeau, Canada had a reconciliation agreement. I'm not quite sure. But if any of you guys have any follow-up on that, let me know. So let's talk about intersectionalizing the 8 principles, making them trendy, making them progressive, with figures like Mark Lamont Hill to back them up, okay? CNN, former CNN before he was fired for some of his very controversial comments, and rightly so. Ilhan Omar of Minnesota in our government. We can go on. Alice Walker and so forth. This is the apartheid wall. Some of you may have seen on your campuses. Basically likening, what does this panel say? It's likening common struggles, US, Israel, Mexico, Palestine. It's a very common trend. There's actually a presentation I highly recommend you guys check out. I can present it in another Zoom call, but it's called 7 Stolen Narratives from Stand With Us that I helped put together based on their pamphlet. And it shows all the comparisons that anti-Israel people make between Palestinians, basically hijacking, comparing Palestinians to other, marginalized groups of people that might have totally different struggles, hijacking their causes and their language and so forth. But likening the US border issue with what's happening between Israelis and Palestinians is completely wrong. For one thing, it's very easy to see that when Mexicans or Central Americans in general, whether they're fleeing civil wars and come to the United States illegally, or they don't have the opportunity to get amnesty or whatever it is, undocumented people and so forth, they're not posing an active military threat where they're going out to commit suicide bombings, shooting missiles on American civilians and so forth. So it's just, the Middle East is a completely different place. You can't make this gross mischaracterization. But nevertheless, exploitation of Western ears, people like us, is very easy in the media and so forth. This is at the National SJP conference. I think this happened in 2018 on my campus. It's actually funny, this is the first year in a while where they were holding the Palestinian flags the right side up instead of upside down, which you can see in previous photos they've had. And here in the center, this is so striking, right? You have Palestinian flags around, but in the center, it's not about Palestine necessarily. It's about abajo con la frontera. That means like, get rid of this border, right? We don't need borders anymore. We don't need these walls. We don't need these things dividing us and so forth, empowering Central Americans and Latinx people side by side with Palestinian flags. These are totally different issues. And yet, National SJP is very wise in their coalition building. They're propping these people up and tokenizing them, and it's actually working. No one calls them out. Linda Sarsour, as I mentioned, when we're pointing out the anti-Semitism in social justice circles, such as the rhetoric that maybe Jersey City shooters, what they believe stuff like this. This gets Jewish people killed today. This isn't just stuff that, this isn't just a matter of white supremacy, but this is stuff that people in mainstream circles like the Women's March are actually spewing. And it hurts Jewish people in America, not just in Israel. Is it a coincidence that pro-IDF Zionists, most of the Jewish people are Zionists? If you look at Melman Report, Gallup poll, etc., statistically we're the majority. Justify murders of unarmed men of color by police in the United States. Is it a coincidence that we're justifying murders of unarmed men of color by police in the United States? What does this do? This is code for saying that Jewish people in America and elsewhere are responsible for Black people and other people of color dying in America. That's blood libel. That is demonization. That is distortion. one of the principles of disenfranchisement, okay? Now, I just gave you a whole list of principles where every anti-Zionist accusation or rhetoric, sentence, statement, you name it, that comes up, you can fit into at least one of those 8 categories, right? But I'm going to show you guys here how Natan Sharansky's 3 Ds of demonization, delegitimization, and double standards, all of my points fit exactly into them. So it's even easier for you to remember. You can take a screenshot of this if you want, although this will be recorded. I mean, it is being recorded right now. I'm also going to send graphics, like I said, after, so you can have this for your reference. But when we look at demonization, distortion and inversion, it's a form of demonization. I'm basically building upon the academic foundations of Natan Sharansky and other scholars. We look at delegitimizing Israel, which is more technical, less personal, right? It's a lot easier to just take this at face value and not question it, because some people might use pseudo-academics, cherry pick statistics and so forth to make anti-Israel, anti-Semitic points, okay? Abrogation, appropriation, deletion, omission. And lastly, double standards, imposing on the Jewish people, discriminating against them, impersonal, okay? So personal, technical, impersonal. This is just like a scholarly format way of taking a look at everything that we covered in the presentation so far. If any of you guys have questions, make sure to throw them in the chat, but we're gonna answer, we're gonna do Q&A towards the end. Almost done. So now I'm gonna take a step back, right? Because I've been talking for quite a while. I've been talking for basically an hour. We're gonna give some examples and see if this doesn't work or if it does work, okay? So any of the 8 principles, if you remember them, see if they apply to these examples I'm giving, okay? And if this concept, the 8 principles of disenfranchisement, these 8 anti-Zionist principles are a fail-proof test or not. Let's go for it. I'm gonna ask you guys to type in the chat. You try. Okay, what do you guys think of this? I'm not even gonna comment on it. I want you guys to give answers yourselves. Take a look at what you all have to say if you disagree with each other. Okay, someone says distortion. Why distortion?
In the chatter and like,
You can use your microphone, that's fine.
I don't know, I was thinking distortion just because it's making it seem like our argument is something completely different, and it's kind of delegitimizing it through that.
Absolutely. Any other thoughts? Anyone else want to jump in? You can use your microphones. Nope. Okay, so I think we can point to this and say this is distortion. We have an ultra orthodox or religious stereotypical Jew being portrayed with guns, as if the majority of settlers actually have arms. It's very difficult to actually get a gun in Israel compared to the United States and other places. Making us claim like anti-Semitism, blah, 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 free Palestine and the occupation. First of all, as if the Jewish people in Israel or Zionists in general are all claiming anti-Semitism with everything that's being argued, and also as if this argument of free Palestine and the occupation is the only thing that Palestinians are arguing about. Nonetheless, ending the occupation requires 2 parties, not just a unilateral withdrawal, which can put Israel in a situation where it'll be much difficult to defend itself, which is essentially allowing Jews to die, which is anti-Semitic. Okay, so we proved that that was anti-Semitic, essentially. Here, this is a quote from Omar Barghouti. So if anyone wants to give their thoughts on this, what principle is this out of our 8 principles? Abrogation, appropriation, deletion, distortion, omission. What am I missing? Discrimination, inversion. don't answer all at once.
Okay, I'll say it's appropriation and omission.
Why so?
Well, it's showing that whatever they think is Palestine was a greater area, and that was just the British mandate. It wasn't really a separate Palestine initially, till they had the partition. And appropriation, they're taking over an area that they think belongs to them, that really belonged to Great Britain, and then the UN divided it up.
Right.
So I think
yeah, I think that's more I think that's more implicit than I think it's explicit. Because it's pretty clear that yes, they're making it seem as though Palestine was its own independent entity prior to Israel existing, so forth. I'm just going to say that I personally think that this is imposition, okay, or discrimination, a form of double standards, saying that the Jewish people do not have a right to a Jewish homeland in their historical territory. I mean, if a Jewish state was actually built in Uganda or Argentina, we could actually say that it was a colonial state, that it was something usurped from people with no connection, nothing, etc., for people with no connection. But yeah, any other thoughts? Does anyone think I'm getting it wrong here? Does anyone think that this isn't anti-Semitism at all? No? Okay, we're going to move on to the next point. All right, I'm using a lot of stuff from my campus at UCLA, if you can see. Here, this is a panel from Students for Justice in Palestine, SJP's apartheid wall that they have annually. This is a quote from Benjamin Netanyahu's Twitter. They're just writing it here. I don't know if you can see. President Trump is right. I built a wall along Israel's southern border. It stopped all illegal immigration. Great success, great idea. Does this fit into any of the 8 principles?
Omission.
Why?
Well, I think just to take one tweet and like out of context completely, by definition, is omitting historical fact, and yeah, period.
Well said. What do you think, Yossi? Distortion, why? Okay, I don't know if you heard me, but if anyone can see it, if anyone can see why it might be distortion, feel free to speak up.
I think that I don't know. I feel like distortion and omission, I keep on getting them confused. But like
omit is leaving out, distortion is making it seem like it's something else.
Okay, so then I think I could argue for distortion because it's saying that it was meant to stop illegal immigration, but it doesn't mention the fact that it was built to prevent terror attacks from happening as well. But I don't know if that's still omission because it's like omitting that fact from the thing.
Right. See, what's very complicated. Oh, go for it. Sorry.
I was going to say, I feel like this is also kind of appropriation, maybe not in the traditional way we use it, but this is almost like, it's equating the wall in America, like the wall that President Trump wants to build, with the wall that is like in Israel.
Right.
So it kind of, it does distort it in that way as well, because then you're putting the same motives to it, and it's not the same thing at all, and it's very different situations.
What's very interesting about this example is that it's very complicated. It's complex, right? Because no matter what you think about US border issues, US-Mexico border issues, right? You might think that Benjamin Netanyahu might actually be putting forth or affirming this negative opinion, right? By almost implying that, you know, not explicitly, but saying that these walls were built for the same reason, implicitly, not explicitly, right? And Israel's wall or security barrier isn't even the majority of the security barrier. It's only a small percent, about 5 to 8% in the West Bank, versus most of it being chain link fence, like you might find it at an elementary school. But SJP taking this and trying to almost exploit it by omitting certain factors of information and just kind of like looking at this at the surface level is very difficult. And yes, there is a distortion at hand, and it is indirectly appropriating things in a different layer. So I'm glad you guys pointed that out. Okay, we're gonna move on. This is Mark Lamont Hill speaking up at the United Nations just before he got fired from CNN, and rightly so, as I said. Anyone want to read this out loud? Volunteers?
While the UN Declaration of Human Rights promises the right to life, liberty, and security of person, Palestinians continue to live under the threat of random violence by Israeli military and police. Unprompted violence in the face of peaceful protests and misdirected violence by an Israeli state that systematically fails to distinguish between civilians and combatants.
Thoughts? I'm glad Sophia put the 8 principles in the chat, so you guys don't have to memorize them all at once. Which principles are these, are reflected in this statement? Calling on a brave soul to speak up. If you've already spoken, you can too as well. There's no worries. Distortion, okay. I'm gonna challenge you, Jessica. I'm gonna say, why distortion?
I think it's leaving out a lot of facts. He's like generalizing that, like, while there are individual incidents in which there was unprompted violence, I don't think that every single incident there is in it erases the fact that whenever it says peaceful protest, it doesn't talk about whenever Palestinians are violent themselves. And like whenever it says misdirected violence, it's just like it erases a lot of the story.
Right. I agree. If anyone disagrees, please speak up. We don't want to be living in an echo chamber here.
Would you say that this is anti-Semitic?
Hold on, I think, let's take Eleanor, and then we'll take Yosef.
Well, I think it's a lot of omission. It omits all the history, and as Jessica said, it's really not truthful, because I don't think the protests from the Palestinians are peaceful protests. There's a long history going back years. I mean, since the state of Israel, but at least since the late 80s and 90s when the intifadas broke out, that those are not peaceful protests.
Right. Yosef.
Would you say, though, that this is anti-Semitic? Because, like, it doesn't ring anti-Semitism in my ears, so I'm wondering what you think of this.
If you replace Israeli state with any other country, right? Doesn't it seem normal? Let's talk about the Uyghurs in China, for example, okay? While the UN Declaration of Human Rights promises the right to life, liberty, and security of person, Uyghurs continue to live under the threat of random violence by Chinese military and police, unprompted violence in the face of peaceful protest, and misdirected violence by a Chinese state that systematically fails to distinguish between civilians and combatants. Okay, while that, you might say, doesn't ring at all of prejudice, it just seems empirical, let's look at the comparison here, right? Because what he's saying is that Israel doesn't distinguish between civilians and combatants. What if that was true? Okay, then maybe that would be legitimate criticism, right? And even aside from that, I think this is omission to the degree of what Ellie said. When we look at the Gaza marches of return, combatants, snipers, people with active artillery, machetes, and so forth, flammable materials. These people are standing around civilians and non-combatants. But when we're talking about whether or not this is discriminatory or not, there's no mention of this in Mark Lamont Hill's account. There's no mention of the asymmetric warfare that's going on, where a lot of children, a lot of minors, a lot of young people or old people are used as human shields on a regular basis. And I think that's what he's omitting here. And even if in the context alone, if you just read it, it's not anti-Semitic explicitly, because of the effect that it provides, you know, basically leaving out this whole reality of asymmetric warfare that's taking place and how Israel has to deal with that. We talk about the reporting of Salah al-Bardawil, who was a Hamas official who came out on Hamas TV and said 53 out of 60 that were shot in the Gaza marches of return were members of Hamas. And then a few extra were from Islamic Jihad and the PFLP and so forth, right? That's context for you. Mark Lamont Hill is not providing context here. And so what is the effect? The effect is Israel, the only Jewish state out there, is not distinguishing between civilians and combatants, but is just indiscriminately killing random people, children, babies, women, medics, reporters, with no context whatsoever. And so if someone says, for example, I'll try to make this an easier concept. This is why these conversations are so important to have about the 8 principles, because a lot of the anti-Semitism is subtle. And that's what makes anti-Zionism oftentimes very difficult to explain to non-Jewish people as being anti-Semitic. And that's what the 8 principles really seek to combat here. But let's say we said Jewish people continue threatening Palestinians or continue threatening, let's say, African Americans. Unprompted violence amid peaceful protests. Jewish people are failing to distinguish between civilians and combatants. Take away civilians and combatants. Jewish people are failing to distinguish between people of color that are committing attacks on their community and ordinary people of color that are walking in supermarkets, right? Would that not ring of anti-Semitism?
Mm-hmm.
When we're talking about gentrification, when we're talking about police brutality, all these trendy, hot topic, important issues in the United States, right? Gerrymandering, whatever it is, blaming Jewish people, putting them on top and saying that Jewish people, or viewing Israel as a Jewish collectivity, put it that way for you. Viewing Israel as a Jewish collectivity, a symbol of a Jewish collective identity to point fingers at, to not see the anti-Semitism there can be challenging, but in that context, I think it's easier to understand. Does that make more sense, Yosef, a little bit?
I see imposition there again. It's imposition because, once again, with your example of China, you would never hear a speech like this in the UN about China, but it's putting a double standard on for what Israel must do, especially for violence.
And asymmetric warfare, where civilians and combatants are mixed together on purpose, intentionally. Okay, I don't want to take too much time on this. We're going to move on. This one we can do pretty quick. I think it's somewhat self-explanatory compared to other ones like the last one we did, which was more subtle. New York Times cartoons section. This was published just last year and later retracted, which is crazy how in 2019 this can be posted, but it is. Let's aim for some new voices. Any new voices? If you don't want to talk in with your microphone, you can type if that works as well in the chat. Let's aim for some new voices. Imposition from Heather G. Why? Why imposition? Imposing what? Is this cartoon imposing the notion that Israel and the United States can't work together because Israel just controls the policy of every country? Imposing the belief that the US blindly follows Israel. You don't know. Okay, it's a good guess. When I'm using the term imposition as a principle of disenfranchisement, I mean imposing a double standard in terms of Israel or Jews not being able to exercise certain rights. Like Israel can't be a Jewish state, imposing that double standard. The Jewish lobby, for sure, we can talk about distortion in the Jewish lobby. I say distortion is the one that stands out the most, which is demonizing Bibi Netanyahu and the Jewish state here. The fact that there's like a Jewish star that Bibi's wearing instead of like some other symbol. I know people say, how can we talk about Israel in political cartoons without using the Israeli flag or Jewish symbols? You can. And there's actually examples of Bibi Netanyahu facing criticism in a political cartoon without any of this imagery that can be easily distorted to be weaponized against all the Jewish people. We could keep talking about this one. Just keep it in your mind. I'm going to move on. This is David Duke of the Ku Klux Klan. Might disagree with Mark Lamont Hill on much, but no decent person can disagree for his beliefs on Israel. Israel was created by horrific human rights crimes, forced ethnic cleansing by terrorism because the Zionists wanted a Jewish state. Free Palestine and free the USA too. Wow. Wow, everyone. Isn't that great? David Duke agrees with the fact that Israel is an awful Jewish supremacist state. Here, I will never stop exposing the truth about occupation genocide of the Palestinian people. We already covered why genocide is a gross mischaracterization. Palestine will never be forgotten. The Goyim know. Hashtag free Palestine, free the world. So what's even scarier is that this notion of freeing Palestine or liberating this region of its Jewish population is freeing the world, right? Then we have these Jewish IDF rats being depicted with this famous Palestinian Ahed Tamimi, infamous for committing attacks against the IDF. Okay, this is going to be the last one, I think, for now.
I see major appropriation, at least on the right side.
Oh, whoops.
Oh, sorry.
Appropriation.
Yeah.
Appropriation. Why?
Well, you know, the use of the language the Goyim know, and also, one second. I think like he could have just used the word occupation, but occupation genocide perhaps also could be an appropriation of our own history. Yeah.
Yes, and I would add also inversion, because genocide, the accusation of genocide against Palestinians, is inverting Jewish history. Specifically, it's a special type of distortion that seeks to take Jewish historical experiences of victimhood and make us the bad guys, the new bad guys, essentially. Okay, gonna move on. This, I'm not gonna spend time covering. You can just imagine what that might be. These are IDF soldiers firing from what looks like to be the defense of the Torah over, this is Arabic for Al-Quds, Jerusalem, Arab Jerusalem, etc. From Palestinian Information and Cultural Commission online. This is the electronic intifada. Israel has suspended core Palestinian rights for half a century. Israel arrests journalists, activists, and so forth for any recognizable crime. They even occur in the West Bank under nominal Palestinian Authority control. We can talk about that. Okay, this I want to point to as well. It says in Hebrew, yoter katan, yoter kashe. The smaller, the harder it is to shoot. This image I've seen in my comments threads by some anti-Israel folks. There's a Palestinian child here holding a sniper rifle, And the Hebrew says, the smaller, the harder, implying it's harder to shoot them because they're children. And whether that's talking about how because it's illegal and immoral to shoot them if they're carrying weapons, or because they're harder to aim at because they're smaller, I don't know. What are your thoughts on this? Is this legitimate criticism to bring up that this is a bad t-shirt? Is this an indication that all Israelis just want to shoot children, or is this an exception? Where does this fit in the 8 principles? Does it fit at all? Does it not fit at all?
I think it's also harder to shoot at a child. It's just morally, it's another question. But I do think the Palestinians enlist children in their efforts, in their terrorism.
Anyone else have thoughts on this?
I'm kind of torn on this because it is kind of like, I mean, the shirt is awful, right? So that's why I'm torn on it, just because if this is like a legitimate shirt that's being sold in Israel, I think it does kind of warrant some valid criticism. I don't think that it's obviously indicative of most of the population or anything like that, but.
Well said. Anyone else have any thoughts? Again, I'm encouraging and welcoming disagreement.
Well, yeah, this shirt is pretty bad. I do know that Israel, more than the U.S., has a long-lasting culture of designing custom shirts.
Right.
I think the issue with every youth group, like every year, every child gets like a custom shirt. I think the issue with this is taking, this one example and generalizing an entire population with it that live in Israel, and yeah, meaning to say that like we also have radical people in the United States, but those radical people do not and are not representative of the entire population and country.
I agree. I think I specifically chose this example because I wanted to distinguish for you guys that, yeah, we can look at real criticism of Israel or of certain like token exceptions of really bad stuff. But could you be a Zionist and condemn this shirt? Yes or no?
Yes.
Yes. And you could also be an anti-Zionist and condemn this shirt. But the fact is, I wouldn't say that opposing this shirt is really an anti-Zionist argument. It just seems like a distortion or an exaggeration if that's the intended effect, right? Mm-hmm. But anyone can oppose this. Opposing this shirt has nothing to do with saying that the Jewish state has no right to exist unless you're indicating that this represents everyone in the Jewish state, including the IDF, saying like the IDF makes these shirts, which just isn't true, or that everyone sells these shirts, etc. in Israel. Okay, moving on. Zahra Belu, again from the Women's March, who was kicked off shortly after she was selected to it. This is one of the things that was pointed out in considering her being voted off. No need for a Holocaust museum, seeing as Israel has taken it upon itself to recreate it. Israel, Nazis, etc. Okay, I think that's pretty self-explanatory. It's distortion, a form of demonization. If anyone disagrees with me or has a different idea, speak up. No, I'm going to move on though. We're almost done. Okay, Mahmoud Abbas, Palestinian Authority president, Fatah, his party of the PA. There was an official PA government article in Al Hayat Al Jadida saying that the hospital to serve the US as an espionage station where it was established. This quote basically is talking about a hospital, this is before Corona, saying that Israel is harvesting Palestinian organs in this United States funded hospital institution in the Palestinian territories, okay? It's an espionage station. to carry out experiments on sick Palestinians. The hospital will be a partner in trafficking in human organs. Does this sound like blood libel to you from the classical era of anti-Semitism or the Nazi era and so forth? Or does this sound like something completely different? Is this anti-Semitism? Is it distortion? Is it inversion? What is it? Is it omission?
I think it's all of them.
All of them. Okay. I can see that. Yeah, it's a lot of them. I'm going to move on. Okay. This is the last one we're going to do. This is, I had to do one for Corona, guys. I couldn't say no. I had to make this presentation slightly more relevant. Okay. Israeli racism is exploiting this Corona epidemic as an opportunity to act violently and settle accounts and to exert more pressure on our prisoners, referring to Palestinian terrorists that have been incarcerated for their terror attacks. Okay. Regards from me to all of our prisoners in the occupation's prisons, because these prison guards want to spread Corona epidemic among you. Okay. Are Jews spreading Corona? Is the Israeli state spreading Corona?
On purpose?
Are they spreading Corona on purpose? If
No,
so,
it's been one of the countries, if not the country, that's been most effective at dealing with Corona.
right, and even the UN, which has been problematic at commending Israel instead of bashing it, has come out and commended Israel's cooperation efforts with Palestinians on coronavirus. So that's something notable. But this still goes on. This is on official Palestinian TV. This is Palestinian government TV. This is a government spokesman. So all these accusations, like we've shown, are at the tier of social media, from student orgs to the BDS movement, social justice spaces, social justice movements like the Women's March, and even education and so forth. Okay, Jew hatred in both theory and practice. As we close up this presentation, we can compare Jew hatred in both theory and practice. So let's talk about anti-Zionism as being anti-Semitic in theory. Breaking down, like, what is anti-Zionism as a theory? In general, I've defined it as opposition or hostility disproportionately targeting the idea or practice of 1, a Jewish refuge and Jewish continuity; 2, reclaimed Jewish freedom and identity; 3, Jewish self-determination; and 4, basic Jewish human equality. Equality on a human level for the Jewish people. And this is all excluding leveled criticism of Israeli policies. Okay? All these things are de facto anti-Semitic. This is how I'm defining anti-Semitism in theory, anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism in theory. Okay? Without wiggle room here. And then in practice, flipping it around, the 8 anti-Zionist principles are anti-Zionism in practice, no longer as theory. Because it's essentially impossible to find an anti-Zionist argument. Anti-Zionist, I'm saying that, like going back to theory, denies all these things: Jewish refuge, Jewish continuity, reclaim Jewish freedom and identity, Jewish self-determination, and Jewish human equality. Israel fulfills all these things, okay? In practice, using any of these 8 points, and most anti-Zionist accusations use at least a few of them, not just one, but some use maybe one, but all of them at least fit into one of the categories, guaranteed. If they don't, we can shut off this presentation, end it, we can throw it in the dustbin, or we can revise it, whatever you want. But my point is this: these 8 points stick, they really do, because they purport or rely on inherently anti-Jewish, obsessive, and malevolent rhetorical approaches and behavior that are not logical if you want to make a sound critical argument, a criticism of Israeli policies, okay? So that's anti-Zionism for you in theory and practice, and that's why 100% of the time what we may consider anti-Zionism according to these criteria is anti-Semitic. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone who repeats things they heard on the news or just anti-Zionist ideas that they may have absorbed on Twitter, that doesn't make them an anti-Semite. However, we need to combat this rhetoric because this rhetoric is anti-Semitic. It promotes anti-Semitic outcomes of Jews not having a home, of Jews not having rights, of Jews not being able to practice their religion and celebrate their culture. And so that's why it's important to call it out as anti-Semitic, not necessarily having to call everyone out as an anti-Semite, but recognizing its issues. So what are some tools and things you can do with this information? You can educate your community on the 8 principles. Again, I'm going to provide you guys graphics, screenshots, and so forth that are easy to educate people with. You can collaborate with other student orgs, your faculty on campus, offices at work, etc., your synagogue community. You can challenge anti-Zionist spaces with a means of accountability by showing them which 8 principles their statement just fit into, to basically explain to them, this is logically why what you said was anti-Semitic and problematic. I don't need to call you out. I can call you in, and we can work this out together and learn from each other and build dialogue, build bridges. You can review your campus policies, bylaws, and hold your university accountable. If there's something in your university system, whether it's a guest lecturer that is facilitating anti-Semitic lectures, other campaigns or issues with a student government on campus. For example, in the University of Toronto, they called for banning kosher food in the past year from their Graduate Students Association, from Hillel, because Hillel is a pro-Israel organization. Easy to see how that's anti-Semitic. It's not difficult to see how that could be anti-Semitic. So if you need to review your campus policies, I highly recommend doing that. Draft a proactive student government resolution on your campus, incorporating these 8 principles. While it may seem like 8 is a lot, it's really much shorter compared to the entire IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. So highly recommend using this. Initiate campaigns that expose current local anti-Israel activity and speech, and use these concepts. Congrats! You now know the 8 anti-Zionist principles. You're so woke. You guys are amazing. So that's my information. I want you to keep this in your minds and in your hearts, and feel free to reach out to me at any time. That's my email. There's my Twitter at Ishsadeh with a Y at the end for Yitzchak. And there's my Facebook. You can follow me there. I also have an Instagram. And if you need anything, always feel free to reach out to me. Now we're going to go for Q&A. So you can all unmute yourselves if you'd like, unless you have a loud background. And I'm really glad to have been able to present this to you. So I'm going to just leave this up here for now. And if anyone wants to ask any questions, go for it.
I just want to make a comment. I'm in with UC Irvine, and we've had a lot of problems with anti-Semitism on campus. You may remember several years ago, we had the Israeli ambassador come speak, and Palestinian students actually prevented him from speaking. So after that, in collaboration with our Jewish Federation, we started several projects to help Palestinian students and Jewish students work together. It's taken years, but the UCI student government, just before we all shut down, voted to no longer have any activities towards participating in BDS. They have gotten rid of it on the campus. So it is possible to make big changes, and I'm very proud of our students there.
That's great. Yeah, I've heard the news recently. I'm very glad that that's the case, that there's been major reform in eliminating BDS on campus at UC Irvine, which is crazy. Okay. Yes, excellent. I want to respond to Yosef because this is what his question is, really what this presentation is all about, right? How does someone criticize Israel for wrongdoing without it being anti-Semitic? Okay. Oftentimes, let's be real, people from many social causes, if they have criticism of their social cause, they oftentimes will try to stifle that criticism from certain groups of people because their movement gets a lot of flack anyways. This is true of the feminist movement. People complain of the feminist movement all the time. The feminist movement is this, the feminist movement is that, the civil rights movement was this, etc. So sometimes people will only criticize certain things in their movement or their cause within their own circle, and sometimes even sparingly because they get enough flack. I think we need to criticize Israel as much as we can properly, because we care about Israel. Israel is home for many of us, for our families as well. And we have such a strong affinity and connection to it in many cultural and spiritual ways. So as long as we are criticizing Israel openly, with accountability, like it'll give us credibility from other people, but we just need to make sure that we follow these 8 points of not abrogating Jewish history or identity, not appropriating it in our criticism, not deleting points of Jewish history, identity, etc., omitting facts about the conflict, not distorting Jewish or Israel's experiences, etc., its conduct, not inverting Israel's historical significance or its role in the conflict, Jewish people, etc., not imposing a double standard on Israel or discriminating against it in its very basic right to exist. I'm also gonna go back to these points, because as long as you're not opposing Jewish refuge and continuity, reclaim Jewish freedom and identity, Jewish self-determination, Jewish human equality, it seems to be fair game, right? You can talk about, like, for example, if Israel were to somehow accidentally shoot a medic, okay? Razan Najjar, I don't know if you guys remember her, Razan Najjar, they did a New York Times investigation of her and her death, her being shot. And this was in the Gaza March of Return. This blew up on social media. It was in 2018, I believe. It was very, very big. And pro-Israel people were sometimes making excuses, were sometimes saying, no, it didn't happen. We don't know the full story, blah, blah, blah. And after the New York Times investigation came out, what we found out was Razana Najjar had a ricocheted bullet from an Israeli sniper who authorized the bullet. That might be written in the investigation, but the fact is that Razana Najjar, a Gazan medic, was not shot intentionally, and Israel apologized for it, and many people mourned her death, right? You can say, oh, she's a horrible person. She was trying to, heal people who were throwing Molotov cocktails at the IDF, etc., at Israeli civilians and so forth, trying to burn Israeli farmland and so forth, whatever. We can talk about that, but from a medical perspective, from a basic moral standpoint, Israel didn't shoot her. We shouldn't be like exaggerating about it, that she was endorsing terrorism or anything. She was a medic in Gaza, etc. Okay, and that criticism of Israel having shot her is legitimate, that there wasn't enough oversight. It was an accident and happened, but there should have been more oversight in authorizing what had happened, right? Where that might cross into the line of anti-Semitism is saying that Israel did it on purpose. Israel always shoots medics and civilians. That's crossing the line, and that's where it becomes anti-Semitic.
I just want to push back a little.
Yeah, sure.
What about, so we just talked about like an individual instance. What about when the instance is not for like a particular event, but like the government, let's say, is historically bad at, let's say, X or Y? Can criticisms like that exist without being anti-Semitic? So, like, for example, let's say, and this is different example, but Israel is not great at integrating its minority, its Jewish minority population into its culture. Let's say Ethiopians, Mizrahi communities. Are statements like that kind of criticize, I guess, like...
I will tell you that is absolutely legitimate criticism. That is not anti-Zionist or anti-Semitic. Sometimes people will use issues in the intra-Jewish or intra-Israel community and use them as a basis or as a justification for denying Jews the overall right to have a refuge, to have continuity, to have reclaimed freedom, identity, a Jewish state, and human equality by exercising those rights. And that's where it becomes problematic. So a lot of the challenge of navigating, figuring out whether things like this are anti-Semitic or legitimate criticism is is intentions. And I think it's not so difficult to delineate what someone's intentions are if they're using that to back up an argument. But if someone is focusing on, let's make Israel a better, more hospitable place for all of its citizens, and you look at, for example, the Solomon Teka example of the Ethiopian Israeli who was killed by an Israeli police officer that created a huge uproar in the Ethiopian, Israeli, and just general Israeli community and so forth, you know, out of nowhere. We can talk about that, and I would say that's legitimate criticism, but taking that and saying that Israel is, you know, 100% systemically like anti-Black, like just as bad as like South Africa during apartheid, that's like taking it a bit far, saying that Israel is just as bad as like Jim Crow in the way it treats its minorities. I think we can say that while Ethiopian Israelis and other minorities, even Arab Israelis, face hardships, even on a systematic level, we can debate about this, right? To what extent that is. That's not the same. You can't compare that to the way that African Americans in the United States have fared since slavery up till the present day. There might be similar trends of anti-Blackness, but that's a worldwide phenomenon. And so to place that criticism on Israel and say Israel needs to like not exist as a country, or its government needs to be completely dismantled as a Jewish state, blah, 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 because of this situation, you can look at all these different countries that have anti-Blackness or anti-Arab attitudes and rhetoric, policies, whatever. And, you know, why are you picking on Israel first? It's all about the double standards. And that's why it would be anti-Semitic. Okay. That's basically it. Any other questions? If not, we're going to.
Hello?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Hello, Erica. Yes.
Yes. I have a question. So on your intersectionality slide,
Sure.
there was a poster about like what SJP has in common with other minority groups. Has that been called out by other groups on campus? Because what they're doing is basically putting different groups in a monolith when really there's like different issues within those groups. Yeah, in the
100%. That's a really good question. And I think oftentimes on campus, they actually get away with it. The reasons for that might, you know, vary from time and place. On our campus, it's certainly held strong. But on certain campuses, they get called out. I don't know necessarily with the Latinx community that they've been called out sufficiently, except for maybe some people or individual students on campus. Obviously, not every single Latinx person is going to be like involved with SJP or even know about the Israeli-Arab conflict, right? But I think, you know, on your campus at Columbia, like with a few years ago, with the queer community, LGBTQ students on campus, there was a session where actually Columbia SSI was able to point out the hypocrisy and the exploitation, the tokenization, and the hijacking of you know, queer narratives on campus, and saying that you know, Israel's only pinkwashing, whereas what people in SJP tend to do is they tend to make excuses for people in Hamas or in the PA that commit human rights violations against the LGBTQ communities in the Palestinian territories. So the queer community is one front where we've seen some success, not a lot, but some success with pointing out this exploitation. With other communities of color, it's been more challenging. And that might speak to the level of animosity with which Jews are presented as a monolith, as like one white, privileged, supremacist entity on campus as a monolith, you know? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions, comments? Did any of you guys feel like this presentation really struck a chord with you? Did it make you upset? Did it give you hope? What are your thoughts?
I think a lot of it is relatable as far as like
It was
things that we
outstanding and a
experience.
great way to organize a lot of complicated information.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, back to you.
Oh, don't
Aria?
worry. I was just saying that I think a lot of it is relatable and very applicable to things happening on campus. We have like an SJP that started up last year now, but it's pretty new and it's been very hard to like give them criticism at all, or stop any events from happening on campus that were kind of like, I'm sorry, we were having like a Holocaust denier come and speak last semester, and I really couldn't do anything about it. And so things like that, this is, I think this is something that could help be used against people like that coming to speak. Like I do want to go out to my school at some point and have things to show them. So yeah, I'll probably be using that.
Sounds good. And you can always send them this presentation if it helps, or have them shoot me an email. I'm the only Jew on the Equity, Diversity, Inclusion Student Advisory Board of my school. So I've been doing a lot of thinking over anti-discrimination issues in general. And these 8 principles, while they especially resonate in the things that we face doing Israel activism, they can probably be used as a measure to tell the difference between whatever, like just discriminatory language of a social movement and legitimate criticism, discrimination and legitimate criticism. So, okay, I think we can close up unless anyone has any final thoughts. What I'm going to ask you guys to do is, once you find this live stream or the recording that I'm going to disseminate, I'm going to try to shoot you guys an email as a reminder, but if you guys could share this over, I'm going to be posting all over Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, all of the content, the big content that we covered today. And it would be great if you guys could share this. I'm really glad that we were able to have these conversations and interact, not just me lecture the whole time. And I'm really glad that we were able to do this together. So thank you so much for attending. Give yourselves a round of applause. And with that, I hope you have a beautiful night. Stay safe, wash your hands, try not to touch your face, keep a social distance, and be well.
Thank you, Justin.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Justin.